Hello, I'm Mishka, and this channel is the Helsinki Renaissance, and this video is about what is postmodernism and why isn't it any good. Now, the reason why I'm doing this video is because, well, some other people have been doing some other videos, well, that I've recently seen. At least one person did a video that was something like an open letter to Jordan Peterson defending postmodernism or something. It was like some sort of an, I don't know, some sort of an audiovisual essay with a bunch of strangely linked thoughts about postmodernism with some elevator music in the background. And then I also saw another person being less of an apologist for postmodernism, but still halfway suggesting as if there's something slightly worthwhile about postmodernism, and that we shouldn't be totally dismissive towards it. But even though it perhaps sounds unfair to some people, I think that we should be something like categorically dismissive towards postmodernism, because how science operates is that if there is something that despite no matter how much criticism is leveled against some theory, if the theory seems to still stand no matter how criticized it is, for instance, something like Darwin's theory of evolution, it received a massive amount of criticism when it came out, and the theory, because people think that there's something good about the theory, no matter how criticized, how dismissed it is, it's still there. So if there's something, if there's any degree of valuable information in postmodernism, it can withstand any manner of hundreds of millions of people being categorically dismissive of it. So from a scientific standpoint, it shouldn't matter in the least if large portions of population are against postmodernism. So there's that for just putting that out there. But then I just gave this as background information as to why I'm even talking about postmodernism. So because I've seen some videos about people who, for whatever reason, aren't part of that crowd who would be categorically dismissive of postmodernism. So to potentially convince some of those people who are on the fence to be on the side of being dismissive towards postmodernism, I'm doing this video. So anyway, the first question of what is postmodernism? Well, lots of people who would want to lend some sort of an air of mysticism towards postmodernism, that it's this wonderful thing that's difficult to explain briefly, and that I just think that the name itself gives all the definition that you need, in that that modernism initially would position itself against classicism, so that whatever made up the classical canon, that was its own field of culture, and then all newer theories that couldn't be incorporated to the classical canon made up the canon of modern theories, and then postmodern theories would be the framework of all of the different theories that came up significantly after both the classical canon and the modern canon. So the entirety of the different theories out there in, let's say, academia that cannot be incorporated to either the classical canon or the modern canon, those are the postmodern theories. So just it's not a case that in the last 70 years that everything in academia would ipso facto be postmodern because some things in academia can be incorporated to the classical canon. For instance, obviously, if somebody is like a student of philology or whatever, they aren't somehow standing in opposition to the classical canon. So there's plenty of stuff in academia that can coexist with classicism and modernism, but some of those subjects in academia that cannot be treated in the framework of classicism or modernism, they have to be postmodernism because it's the only category left for them. So even if postmodernism isn't about some one specific thing, even if it would be some sort of a garden of forking paths, as Jorge Luis Borges might put it. But, just from a purely temporal standpoint, the different strands in academia can all be labeled under the heading of postmodernism. And I certainly don't see the situation in the kind of light that modernism would automatically be a more advanced form than classicism, and postmodernism would be a more advanced form of modernism. I don't see the situation in that kind of a way because not all modernists had mastered the classical canon, and not all postmodernists had mastered the classical canon and the modern canon, and then would have presented an evolved version of it. So because there's sometimes just a minuscule overlap between the people forwarding some of those theories, that an overlap between their awareness of the different theories that they are ostensibly in opposition towards, you can't really use any kind of an evolutionary argument. So, just like a modern composer isn't automatically a more advanced composer than Mozart just because they are a more recent composer, just like not all theories are automatically more advanced just because they are more recent. So it's just and I don't know. I would put them on a horizontal plane rather than a vertical plane, so that the people who are favoring postmodern theories for whatever reason, I get the sense from them that they treat various postmodern theories as if they are more advanced forms of more advanced forms of the different options available, but because a lot of the people who just when they are teenagers or young adults, they just graduate into the postmodern field without necessarily having any kind of presence in the classical or modern fields. It just seems like willful stupidity to think that they first were part of that earlier scene and then evolved out of it. I mean, uh, I just want to side against that mentality that it's as if some people want to put everything that's more recent into some sort of a higher category, because in some kind of sciences, the more recent material, because in some sciences the more recent material is the most advanced material, that the recent generations of scientists have genuinely mastered everything that came before and have discarded what was unnecessary about it. There are some sciences where you could perhaps see some sort of a situation where if you put on a vertical axis, you could see the newer material as being the most advanced, but certainly in all of those inexact social sciences, you wouldn't necessarily take it for granted that the newer generation would have mastered everything that came before. And I just used that Mozart analogy in that it would be fairly asinine to think that newer composers are automatically more advanced than Mozart, because Mozart started his studies at the earliest stage possible, and there's lots of people who certainly haven't done any kind of comparable levels of studies, and because in some fields there's a greater subjective core to the creativity. You have to put them on something that's more like a horizontal plane. But anyway, the question of what is postmodernism in arts or academia, because if there is some sort of a garden of walking paths, the situation that what is postmodernism in art, what is postmodernism in the, let's say, sciences, because they don't necessarily have any kind of uniform presence across the arts and sciences as to what postmodernism wants to be. It's more like everything that stands in opposition to classicism and modernism has to be labeled under postmodernism, because it's maybe too general a movement to meaningfully be described without comparing it to what it isn't. I don't know to what an extent you should even enter conversations about what is postmodernism. It is various different tendencies in the arts and sciences of the last, let's say, 70 years. Anyway, in the arts, modernism, I would draw it from somewhere like 1860s, from the Paris of Charles Baudelaire and Edouard Manet and Richard Wagner even. So that people who rejected the tonal practices of the classical way of doing arts, so that if Edward Manet, if he disliked the idea that there was some sort of a necessity to be graceful, that you had to create some sort of a you certain things were that the overall culture predetermined what was right and what was wrong, and basically if an artist didn't follow the somewhat homogeneous tastes of a given field, if Edward Manet, for instance, if he didn't accept just being graceful with his paintings, if he didn't just want to do something that played up to viewer expectation, then the various viewers would say that Manet did something wrong if he did something in an anti-classical manner. So modernism, when it initially came, people like Baudelaire, Manet, Wagner, they wanted the liberty to go their own way. They wanted, if they wanted to do something that the critics would call atonal, for instance, if they wanted to have something be a bit more shocking, if they wanted to do something that would later be called something like a Brechtian alienation device, they wanted the liberty to go their own way. So that was what modernism initially came to be. So artists wanted a greater amount of liberties. The pre-Raphaelite brotherhood in British painting, for instance, is sort of the most emblematic element in modernism in art, in that it's just very much artists didn't like that critics only accepted certain generic traits in art, and if you didn't just copy paste, or that if you didn't just do variations of a generic theme, they said that you were doing it wrong. Artists of that pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, they said that they wanted to do something that was the opposite of generic, and they wanted some sort of a like-minded audience that would admire their adventurous spirit. And so modernism was just initially a question of trying to break the mold. Artists who would allow themselves, a bigger palette, that there wouldn't be such a codified difference between right and wrong, so that different kinds of I'd say that modernism in art initially became just outside the box thinking, so that completely new practices could be accepted. That was what modernism initially came to be about. And so modernism from around 1860s to around, let's say something like 1910 or 1920, when there was the kind of situation that after around 50 years of modernism, there came a situation that the youngest generation of artists who started arriving to the scene, the youngest generation of artists had never received the kind of classical education. So Pablo Picasso, for instance, he said that when he was young, he studied how to draw like Raphael, but then the older he got, he decided to disassociate himself from that kind of classical learning. And if Picasso, when he was 5 years old, he tried to draw like the old masters, and then when he was old, he tried to draw like a 5-year-old. So there was a situation that people of Picasso's generation might have started to be among the last generation to still have some kind of relation to the classical body of learning, so that what created the shift from modernism to postmodernism is when all of the Jorge Luis Borges, for instance, is a good example. Is that Borges was an artist who, all of his life revolved around the classics. I mean, Borges basically lived in his library. He lived for the classics, from the histories of Tacitus to Edgar Allan Poe, and from Dante and Shakespeare to hard-boiled detective novels or something. But like Borges, he just absolutely loved the classics of literature, but he was a modernist because he wanted a bigger palette. He wanted the freedom to do outside the box decision making. But just the thing is that those modernists of the first 50 years, they all had a link to the classical way of doing things. But when modernism started gaining more respect, what happened is that people started disassociating themselves from the classicism, so that the young painters couldn't claim, like Picasso, that in their youth they could all paint like Raphael. That younger poets couldn't claim that they could write classical sonnets with rhyme schemes and steady meters. That when you started having the kind of situation that it was there was a modernist generation of teachers teaching students who had lived under the age of modernism. So that's how postmodernism came, when the link to classicism was lost. When younger poets couldn't be like Borges, they didn't surround themselves with classics, they surrounded themselves with modern works. And then when painters, poets, composers, film directors, what have you, sculptures, opera composers, etc., when the link to classicism was lost, that's when postmodernism in art was born. And that because people basically didn't have the solid ground of classicism, which is, say what you will about classicism, but it is building on the basics that centuries of culture have proved to be enduringly popular with the audience. So that some playwrights don't exactly know why something works with the audience, but they know what works and what doesn't work. If there is that kind of a solid ground built on just an awareness of what for centuries has worked. So when that solid ground disappeared because modernists just too disassociated themselves with the classicists, that's when postmodernism in art was created. In that when one generation demanded to themselves the right to do outside the box thinking, then when they just started teaching to the younger generations this all importance of outside the box thinking, what happened is that the younger generations no longer have the solid ground of classical competence. So that nowadays it's not as if composers are choosing not to do things with the idiom of Viennese classicism. It's not as if young painters are choosing not to do Raphael's triangular compositions. It's not as if young playwrights are choosing not to write in the verse form of Molière, for instance. Like, they've never been taught that. They have no presence in those classical models of doing things. So all that students have left is what their teachers once told them is the all-important outside-the-box thinking. So now there is this kind of out of control, culture of chasing novelty in postmodernism, because we just don't have that kind of common ground of the classical competence that was there for centuries in art. From architecture to literature, painting, sculpture, whatever. Like, there was a certain kind of common ground that connected one generation to another. And, obviously, the medieval sculpture, Renaissance sculpture, Baroque sculpture, 19th century Romantic sculpture, they all vastly differed from one another. The Baroque sculptures had completely different preoccupations than the medievals, and so on. But what they had was a certain kind of a common ground connecting the different generations. And then what modernists did was basically to break that link, that tradition that connected the generations. And now the postmodernists in art are basically various generations adrift. It's my prediction that there will be a return, because if you've observed art history, you know just how circular the movements are. People keep returning to the past. The Italian Renaissance, for instance, it was the rebirth of ancient Greece and Rome. The Italian Renaissance was all about completing the circle, returning to the ways of doing things in what kind of architecture did they have in antiquity, what kind of sculpture did they have, what kind of poetry did they have, what kind of literature did they have, what kind of writings of history, philosophy. The Italian Renaissance was a grand return to the golden age of Athens and Rome. And it is how art history keeps working. They keep revolving, returning to the past, and we will eventually, in this circular motion, complete the return to the common ground of classical competence. You just need to have a generation that grows tired of the formlessness of postmodernism. It just takes one generation of wanting once again to be able to draw like Raphael, to be able to do music with the idiom of Viennese classicism, to rediscover the poetry in Shakespeare's playwright and whatever, to just be able to find inspiration, just like Jorge Luis Borges. I don't think that we will go to the kind of more straitjacketed form of 18th century neoclassicism that very much had the kind of doing variations on a generic theme. I don't think there's any return to that, but I think that what we can return to is the kind of Jorge Luis Borges model where you want to reserve the right to do things slightly differently, but what you want to maintain is the common ground of classical competence. So, that much for the postmodernism and art. And then as far as postmodernism and something to do with scientific mentality, well, I left a comment in one of those videos that I mentioned in the introduction of this video as to, some postgraduate students said that, we shouldn't be so dismissive of postmodernism because there's something formidable about it. The comment that I left in that video is that I see postmodernism as really easy to dismiss. And basically, I dismiss it in science by saying that it is not scientific. And the reason why I say that it is not scientific is because Karl Popper made a claim that one of the characteristics of genuine scientific methodology is that you have to have something be falsifiable. So if how science works is that you have some sort of a theory, and then you leave your theory for peer reviewing, so that your peers test whether your theory is worth anything or not. And the only way for the peer review process to be worth anything is that if your theory can either be proven correct or proven incorrect. And the way for the peer review process to be able to prove something either correct or incorrect is if it's theoretically falsifiable. So what it means is that you need to be able to posit something specific. If you posit something specific, it can either be observed to happen the way you claim it to happen or not. But if you don't posit something specific, what you do is that there's such a formless mass of obfuscatory jargon mongering that there's nothing even theoretically falsifiable in what you're doing. You cannot scientifically debunk what was never scientific to begin with. Everything to do with the various forms of postmodernism in academia, none of it is falsifiable. It is just the kind of full-time sophistry. It's people basically that's what the Italians called, I don't know if it's still valid, but there's a word called terribilità. So that Michelangelo Buonarroti was said to have a lot of terribilità to his person. That is basically like there's something awe-inspiring or something. There's something that a person has a certain kind of presence that others think twice before confronting or something. I think that a lot of the postmodernists, they have a certain kind of a pose, and then others are worried about confronting them because the situation with postmodernists becomes a bit like was it Mark Twain who said that you should never argue with an idiot because they pull you down to their level and then beat you with experience. I think that whenever anyone would try to start arguing with a postmodernist is that they set the terms. They set the terms with their jargon mongering, and then they just throw everything and the kitchen sink at you, and then they call you a racist, sexist, imperialist, Nazi. And if you don't agree with them, it's because you've internalized colonialism or something, and they just defeat you with ad hominem arguments and all manner of non sequitur logic, and they'll just be able to be so obfuscatory in how they're doing is that because what they're doing is such out of control nonsense that no one can really spot any kind of specific claims that could theoretically be falsifiable. No one can have a reasonable conversation with them because all that they are doing is full-time sophistry. The reason why they are doing full-time sophistry is because they get a certain kind of power in doing that. They make themselves some sort of a moral magistrate, and they are passing moral judgments on various individuals and institutions, and they are acting like some sort of a secular high priests of their secular religion of postmodernism and the various theories therein. And anyone who would try to argue with them is already losing because you try to approach them as if there's something scientific in what they're doing, but it's very intrinsically anti-scientific, that kind of a framework of professional sophistry that they are doing. So that, again, my original recommendation to people was to just categorically reject everything to do with postmodernism. Because if postmodernism has a framework of theories and those theories turn out to be right, then just like every other theory of science, they've been able to withstand scrutiny, they've been able to withstand rejection. So if postmodernism has anything right, certain individuals rejecting them can't do anything about them. But if there is some sort of a situation that the postmodernists are just trying to bluff their way into relevance, then they will absolutely, just somehow fade away if people stop humoring all of that nonsense that they are doing. So, as I've been mentioning in some of the previous videos that I've been doing, so some Canadian professors like Jordan Peterson or Godsard, for instance, they are very categorically rejecting everything to do with postmodernism, and I'm very categorically rejecting everything to do with postmodernism. And, I would sort of identify with something that's like Jorge Luis Borges's, brand of modernism that keeps relation to the classical core. So, I certainly don't see myself as a full-time classicist by any means, but I just I've never been able to associate with postmodernism in any way. It just seems to me to be so silly. Perhaps, just like a stopped clock is right a couple of times a day. I'm sure everyone involved in postmodernism is right here and there, but certainly the overall culture of postmodernism to me seems silly in the extreme. And I'm not alone, but if some people want to feel like I'm not giving postmodernism their due, I'm not being reverential enough towards it, then you can feel that way. But I just gave my 2 cents with regards to this whole thing. So yeah, there it is.